The sea rose and fell in dark heaves against the western cliffs, each swell breaking with a low, sullen thunder among the mouths of caves beneath the rock. Salt dampened the air and made the torches hiss. Brynden Tully crouched at the lip of a black gap scarcely taller than a mailed man, his cloak sodden and his hair clinging in iron-gray curls to his skull. The men with him were quiet, Northmen and rivermen alike, faces angular in the wavering orange light, hands tight on iron hooks and coils of tarred rope. Somewhere behind the roar of the sea a bell tolled in Lannisport, slow and distant as a heart at rest. "There," the Blackfish said, pointing to a seam of stone that showed itself only when the wave drew back. "The old Fisher's Cut. When the water ebbs, you move. When it surges, you hold. If you slip, you'll be dashed to pieces. If he speaks, gag him. If he runs, put steel in him." If the gods had wanted this done easy, they'd have given the lions wings and bid them fly away. He went first, of course. He clipped his hook to the rope and pushed into the mouth, disappearing into the dark with the slow, blunt courage he'd carried since the trident. The first wave came thundering in after him and tried to push the men back, tried to pound their legs into the rock. They leaned and cursed and tasted salt and fear. Then the water slid away and the tunnel breathed in, sighing like some huge sleeping thing, and they moved in a low shuffle, boots scraping, shoulders bumping the wet stone. The Fisher's Cut had been whispered of in Lannisport for 300 years. A man could make good coin showing smugglers where the rock's hard face softened to riddled limestone, where ancient water had eaten secret ways into the cliff belly. The Casterlys had cut steps in some of those holes long ago. The Lannisters had sealed others with iron and mortar and prayer. But smugglers bred stubborn as rats, and rats learned. A generation of Manderley mariners had listened closely, and a winter's worth of coin had found its way into fishermen's hands when the winter was hardest. And here they were. The torch went out when the tunnel turned and the air pressed down like a hand. The Blackfish's voice came back to them as a shape more than a sound. "Leave it. You'll see their light soon enough." And then they were climbing, the rock wet and slick beneath their fingers, sea finding them through seams and cracks, smacking their backs and hoods and hands. A man slipped and a gauntlet fist shot out and caught his forearm and held until he found the next rung cut in the stone. They came to a gate. It had been set across a narrow throat where the tunnel narrowed, and it stank, for this was where the rock pissed. The waste of 1,000 souls slid past in a dark trickle and made the limestone weep and the iron bloom into brown flowers. Brynden put his ear to the wet bar and heard the steady breath of a bored guard beyond. That and the soft rattle of a dice cup. "On my count," he mouthed. It was a count measured not in seconds but in waves, 3 surges and 1 long hush. When the water drew back, he put his weight into the gate. The hinges had been packed with grease against the rot, and some thinking man had set a second brace in the stone, but thought rots too under salt and time. The bar screamed once, quick and high, and the men moved in a rush through a gap unexpectedly wide and brighter than the tunnel had any right to be. The guard got as far as 7, and then the pommel of Brynden's dagger met his teeth. Another hand snatched the cup from the air as it fell. Dice clicked on stone and stopped like little bones of fate. They gagged the men with their own scarves and tied them with their own belts and left them face down in their own stink. Above, where the tunnel became a stair, daylight came in thin and green and uncertain through a grate. At the top of the stair, still more iron. "Keys," breathed a Mallister man, and when none came from the gagged guards, he gave them from his pouch instead, bit of wire and a little flat piece of steel. A minute's fiddling, and the lock yielded with a reluctant sigh. A rush of colder air met them that had no taste of salt or sewage, only old dust and the memory of perfumes. The Blackfish lifted his hand, and the men behind him held their bodies still, even their breath. They had climbed into the rock's lowermost storerooms, where casks lay upon casks and the walls were bored for air and the floors sloped to drains. In that cool dark, the coal candles burned with steady points of soft light. Rats fled at the smell of men and leather and iron. Around a corner, voices murmured idly about a dice game they'd never finish. The men glided through. 3 knives moved as one. One body thumped a little and another caught it, easing it down. The blackfish took the first lion banner he saw and rolled it tight and tucked it beneath his arm. "For luck," he said, and set his men to the next task. The heavy crank of a postern winch that would open a small mouth in the cliff for a moment, long enough, perhaps, if the sea took a gentle breath, for longboats. The rope was greased and the wood oiled and the wheels turned with a genteel creak, the voice of a well-kept secret doing as it was told. Far above, on the wind-scoured terrace that served as the rock's western face, a boy ran to light a beacon in a brazier. He was 12 and proud and cold, and he had been told by his father, who brewed beer in the shadow of Sigurd's tower, that if a Northman asked him to carry fire, he should do it quick and not ask after names. He set the kindling under pitch and blew until it glowed and leapt. The wind grabbed the flame and made it bow and dance. In the distance, the sea wore its winter violet, and above it, the sun had yet to lift itself clear of cloud. On the shore, hidden in little coves and behind great tumbled boulders, the longboats waited. The oarsmen had stripped to breeches and bound wool round their hands. At the beacon's flare, the boats kissed the pebbles once and shoved off with a scrape and hiss. They slid low and dark, and the sea, pleased for the moment, smoothed itself for them. Ropes coiled, hooks flew, iron bit stone and rattled. Men swarmed up like gulls. Gray wind paced in the sand at the water's edge, panting and tasting the night with his tongue. He knew the smell of old stone and blood, the sleeping stink of 1,000 men sweated into rock over 100 years. Now his hackles rose and the hair along his back stood up, not for fear but with that bright, lunging joy that came when his pack ran as one. Robb Stark had his hand on the direwolf's back, feeling the muscle roll beneath wet fur, feeling the tremor of the beast's throat. "Easy," he whispered, and that word had no meaning for Grey Wind, but the tone did. At the sound of the cast-off, the boy king turned his head and saw the boat slip into the cliff's black mouth. Catelyn stood where she could watch the sea and the sky together. Dawn unstitched the clouds with slow, pink fingers. She had not slept. The old fears were in her, the ones that had come with her from Riverrun and that she'd given to the heart tree when she was too young to know what to ask for. She had asked then for a good husband. She had not asked to be the mother of a king. She watched the boats vanish and reappear and knew her brother was there in the stone dark, doing a thing that would either be sung for 1,000 years or never be spoken of again. "Lady," said Ser Wendell Manderly, coming up with his breath steaming. "If they do it, if they take the lower works, the harbor inside the rock is ours. After that, she said, we will see if deep stone listens to wolves." It did. The chains groaned and the little postern yawned long enough for 3 boats, then closed again, then opened again. The men inside sweated and cursed softly and turned the winch. An hour later, soft-footed men were swarming like ants in the lower works, cutting wires that rang little bells in unseen rooms, gagging servants with kitchen rags, locking doors, wedging them with axes. The guards who came down to piss did not return. The guards who came down to look did not return. A man bolted a door on the wrong side and had his face pressed to the wood and an arrow put through it. The iron ring at the bottom of the water stair turned, and an old bolt slid in an old socket with a noise that sounded like the rock clearing its throat. And then there were Northmen in Casterly Rock. They did not come like a storm. There were no horns, no drums, no banners unfurling to slap the sky. The first men up went barefoot. They carried cloth-wrapped axes so the iron would not clang on stone. They moved through the belly of the thing like a fever, in a corridor lined with strange old bronzes. Lions winged like eagles, lions with women's breasts and snakes' tails. They knelt and slid their knives under tapestries to cut the cords that held the hangings, and the cloth billowed down like sedge cut by scythes to smother the room's little shriek. In a pantry, a fat steward reached for a ladle and found a hand on his wrist and a face close to his gray eyes, a trimmed beard, a mouth that did not smile. "You will sit and pour," the stranger said, "and you will forget how to scream. If you remember, we will remember too." The steward nodded until his chins shook, and he poured. Brynden Tully took a stare a level at a time, his hand never leaving the cold stone of the inner rail. He took 2 men at each landing and left them behind like knots in a rope. There was a smell to the rock above, of beeswax and good lamp oil and cedar chests and woman's powder. The walls had been rubbed until they held the shine of generations of careful hands. The castellan's door showed him a lion carved in rosewood. He knocked. When it opened, he moved quicker than a thought and put his palm in the castellan's chest and sent him tumbling back into the room. "Up," he said, once the man had his breath. "Up, and no foolishness. This house is taken, if not in name, in truth. Call your men to lay down their arms quietly, and they may live to carry other banners. Resist, and I don't doubt but the wolves will feed well." The castellan did not believe him. Men never believe until they see their own blood. He called to his guard. 2 men came running with their swords already out, and the first died on the threshold when a Mallister sword touched him and opened him across the belly, and the second died when the Blackfish's knife took him through the eye. The castellan looked at them, at their neatness, at the way the blood made no hurry on the polished floor. Whose men?" he managed. "The river's men, the north's men." Brynden leaned close. "Your choice is to bleed in your liege lord's stone or live to carry a tally of its keys. Which is it, my lord?" The keys came. They were heavy and cold and rang like dull bells. Below, in a place of vaults and iron doors, a boy with a torch took his bearings and set off at a run, and the smoke his torch shed made the air taste sweet and then bitter. In the old mausoleum, the kings of the rock gazed with blank gold eyes. Between them, a door that had not been opened in 50 years swung slowly inward on hinges that gave up the last remnants of their stubbornness with a dry shriek. A muffled cheer swelled and was swallowed by the stone. At sunrise, Robb Stark came into the lower gallery with salt still drying stiff on his hair. He had watched the boats disappear. He had paced the shore with his wolf. He had said nothing for an hour. Then the signal came. A strip of red cloth driven up between teeth of stone in a seam of the cliff, an absurd little pennon that meant the thing was done. He went up with the second wave, with Great John Umber before and Dacey Mormont behind. The passage swallowed them, and they came out into a world of silent rooms, where every noise seemed like a trespass. He did not smile when the Blackfish put the keys into his hands. He felt the weight of them, and the oil that had lived on them rubbed into his skin. The castellan stood with his hands open, empty, watched by 6 men with spears whose shafts had been wrapped in rags to keep them from clattering. "This house," said the castellan, "has never been taken by arms in all its years." "No," Robb said. His voice carried quietly in the stone. "It has been taken by lions and rats, by men who thought words were better weapons than swords. Today it is taken by water and rope. If it pleases you, my lord, we will not test whether it can also be taken by fire." He walked not as a conqueror but as a careful guest, for the rock had a presence like an old lord in his own hall. He looked upon a map room where the western hills were carved in wood and polished to a soft brown, and a room where women's gowns hung in cedar and lavender, and a terrace where falcons had been kept. Small talons had scored the stone in curves like writing. They came at last to a high gallery where a tall window, cut cunningly in the cliff's face and angled away from the prevailing wind, admitted light in a kind, long cascade. The floor was black marble streaked with white like veins under pale skin. 2 great braziers stood cold and empty. Beyond them a chair carved, as if it had grown from the rock, waited with a leonine patience. "Hang it," Robb said. They brought the dire wolf and trout, a single cloth as wide as a house's gable, sewn by women at Seaguard by torchlight and with rough fingers pricked sore. Great John himself took the corner robe and threw the rope over the beam and hauled, grunting. His mouth split in a grin. The black cloth banner rose and rose until it bellowed and fell into place like a winter storm cloud taking the sky. For the first time in 100 years, a thing other than a lion looked out from the western cliff to the cold sea. Lannisport woke to the wolf. The markets murmured, then stilled, then murmured again low and strange. Sailors shaded their eyes against the pale sun and stared at the rockside as if it had grown a second head. A few fools ran. A few true men stood longer at their doors and thought of their children. The harbor went about its business until the sound of iron-shod boots on the stones told it that it should do something else. When at last the city watch came trotting into the square in a neat line, plumes bobbing, cloaks hung just so, they found the watchhouse already under new charge and their sergeant taken 3 hours past by a cook and a butcher's boy with a sledgehammer. By mid-morning, the Manderley cogs were easing into the inner harbor under borrowed banners, while men on the quay chewed their lips. "It's all one to the sea," an old woman said as she sold eels. "Salt is salt." Word went inland faster than any rider could manage, carried by fear into every place where a Lannister retainer kept books and keys. At Ashmark, a steward took off his red cloak and turned it inside out before sitting down to dinner. At Case, the Lord's captain stood on the wall and spat twice and said nothing. At the Bane fort, the bells rang for a fire, and the folk came with buckets and stood with water in their hands to watch the smoke of the Rock's flag. Robb moved like a man surrounded by glass. Every step he took inside the Rock seemed to cost something. The turn of a key, the hush of a shutter, the quick indrawn breath of a servant carrying a basket. He left men in every corridor, posted with orders to do nothing grand. "No looting," he told them. "No drankenis." Treat every room as a September. It was not piety. It was calculation. Plunder fed men for a day and set enemies to plotting for a century. Holding fed a cause. In the old king's hall they met the first true resistance. The household knights, some 30 men with their lions on their breastplates, formed there under a lord with hair the color of fresh straw. He demanded to know by what right wolves came to the Rock. The first arrow took him in the throat before Robb could answer. The second man to shout died with his teeth around the name of his god. The rest broke, not in fear but under a command that had come 100 years too late. Blackfish's men took their swords and sent them to the cells. "We will hold them for ransom," Robb said to Catelyn when he told her of it. "We will send the coin to Riverrun and Seaguard to mend what the lions burned." She looked up at the dark banner and at her son's face and thought how Eddard had looked when he set the first stone at the lower bridge. There was a pride in her that frightened and warmed her both. She said only, "Where is the Castellan's family?" "In their rooms. They will be moved to the high rooms and given a guard and a priest. No harm will come to them. I have given my word." "A king's word," she said. "Spend it as if it were gold and you were a poor man." Not all the gold lay in the Rock now. Some of it lay in Harrenhal, gilding the broken eyes of gargoyles with pale light as Tywin Lannister sat and listened to a messenger try to keep his voice steady. Harrenhal had a way of swallowing men's courage. It took it into its black stone and made it speak in whispers. "The Rock, my lord," the man kept saying, as if he could not make the words mean anything else. "They've hung a wolf over the sea." Tywin stood stiff as a man wearing a shirt of needles. He had been born of order and into order and had imposed order upon every sloppy human thing that had fallen into his hands, and the words brought something hot and dull and grinding into his chest. "How?" he said. "How?" "By sea," said a voice from the room's edge. Adam Marbrand stepped from a shadow as if he had been cut from it. "There are cuts in the cliff. You know it, my lord. We all know the story. Lon the Clever came by trick and laughter. The North came by salt and patience. It could be done, if one knew where to place a boat and a hand." Tywin's jaw moved and went still. He looked at the great hearth where a fire on the order of a small village burned always to warm the cavernous who of the hall. He did not let the anger move his voice. "Send riders to every Leal house. We march west at once." Kevin, quiet, steady, dutiful, made a murmur. "There is still the matter of the south. Stannis moves. The capital. The capital will hold until I tell it to fall or stand. The Rock is our name in stone." Tywin's pale eyes cut to his brother and then back to the brick that had once been a lord's head above the hearth. "You know as well as I, let the river lords think themselves bold. Let the boy in the north think himself cunning. Take a man's heart, and his limbs will fail him. They have their teeth in our heart." He set men moving as if each were a piece on a board his hand had carved. Garrons and destriers stamped and blew, and troops moved out along the roads. The air tasted of frost. When Tywin's column came to the Red Fork, it found Edmure Tully standing warily at the fords, banners tight in the cold and the men's breath pluming. Edmure had the river behind him and a satisfaction in his eye that he tried to keep from his mouth. "My lord," he said when they sent the heralds to speak, and he made that title a weapon. "Shall we talk about crossing prices?" Tywin did not cross. He tried, and twice he sent men into the water, and twice they came out red and without the friends they'd gone in with. The third time he sent a feint and rode north to look for a smaller ford and found nothing but thin ice and a dozen places to freeze a horse and a man together into one bad statue. The wind swung into the west and brought a smell of snow. Tywin sat his horse, breathing into the scarf across his mouth, and watched his own breath drift before his eyes like fog. "Hold," he said, and the word turned hard like glass as it left his mouth. He waited, and in that waiting the South moved. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister leaned over a table where a child's map had been turned to serious use and drew lines with a stick of charcoal until the charcoal broke. His hand shook a little. He had slept less than a man needs to keep himself whole. He had spoken to men who scared him and to women who had learned very early to fear him. The wildfire would burn. That part of his plan held at least, like a green, waiting heart in the dark. But he watched the roads that should have been fed by the west and saw nothing but a trickle and then nothing at all. He wrote his father. He wrote Mace Tyrell. He wrote to men who would never answer letters from any dwarf if they could avoid it. He placed his faith in fire and chains and men's terror of drowning. He told himself 100 times that he had made Archmaester Marwyn's brutality his own. He went to sleep for an hour and dreamed of a lion with a body made of ropes and a head made of straw, and it burned while he could not move, and he woke with his mouth full of smoke and a cry that he killed before it came out whole. Stannis Baratheon came on like winter, inevitable, numbing, pitiless. Davos Seaworth watched the city lift out of the haze like a pile of bones, each tower a finger, each wall a rib. He felt the wind and the spray and knew a fear as clean and understandable as the sea itself. They rushed forward into a place planned by a man who knew fear too. The wildfire lit the river green and then black. Men screamed and went away. Chains rose where no chain should be. Davos lived again through a death he had not had yet and lost sons their mother had given him twice. The Blackwater took them with no more malice than a horse stepping on ants. But when the green fire guttered and the chains snapped and the tide pushed the dead boats into the shallows, there came no trumpets from the west. There came no roar of Tyrell horses or the rhythmic thunder of Lannister steel. There came only the pounding of Stannis' stubborn soldiers and the fleeing of the city's softer men. Ser Mandenmore swung once at a man who had been his lord yesterday and missed hardy steel and hit bone, and a little piece of that white gleamed on the steps. Cersei Lannister sat with a vial in her hand and a boy in her lap and stared at the door for too long. Joffrey showed courage for perhaps the first time in his short life, and then bad counsel undid all. The Septons prayed, and the gods chose winners as the gods always do, by whim and the clatter of unattended stones. By nightfall Stannis Baratheon was in the Red Keep, and Tyrion Lannister drifted in and out of a fever, his face half-cleaved and full of stitches that stung like betrayal. He woke once and saw a crown on the floor near a puddle of water gone red and then brown. He tried to crawl toward it and found a boot on his hand, gentle but firm. "Rest, my lord," a voice said, flat, tired, with the sea in it. "Davos, you've bought more life than any man deserves. Try not to spend it all at once." Cersei lived and Stannis judged her. He had the look of iron that had spent a night in snow, darker, brittle in odd ways. He listened to her speak, if it could be called speaking, the words tumbling and strangling each other as a woman's pride tried to arrange them into something she could bear to hear. He sent her to a tower with her son, and an iron lock took a new polish. He set his hand to restoring, which meant breaking again whatever did not set right under his rule. The city learned a new sort of hunger and a new sort of justice. Men with golden hair cut it. Men with gold chased on their belts scratched the designs off with knives. Songs changed, and mothers stopped their girls' mouths when they sang them too loudly. News of that reached the Rock on a cold, bright morning when the wind blew straight in off the sea and made the banner crack like a whip. Robb listened with his hands around a mug of hot beer and felt his heart do the work it did in battle. Clench, pause, force. He did not exult. He could not. He had a map on the table and tokens upon it for the Mallisters and the Manderleys and the Umbers and a wolf carved by some boy from the shadow of White Harbor. Crude, awkward, dear. He thought of his sisters, one in some tower or another, the other somewhere between rumor and air. He thought of his brothers and of Winterfell, which in his memory had never been cold the way this room was cold. He sent ravens to Stannis and received in time a ship instead. The ship ran close under the rock's shadow, pennon snapping. A lean, weathered man came up to the high room with the smell of tar and rope and brine following him like a cloak he could not take off. Davos Seaworth bowed less than any knight would have, because he bowed from the back he had and not from a lifetime of practice making pride look like courtesy. "Your Grace," he said, "I bear the words of King Stannis and mine own besides. He has the city. He has the throne. He has need of peace in the north if he is to make justice in the south. And the north has need of peace in her own belly." Robb had Catelyn next to him. The Blackfish leaned against a pillar like a shadow cut in stone. Greatjon stood, hands on hips, looking like a man who would agree to anything so long as it had the words axe and meat in it. "Speak your peace," Robb said. Davos laid it out with the humility of a man who knows pride never saved anyone from a wave. "My king is the king by law, your grace, and he will not call you king. But he will call you Robb Stark, and he will call you Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North by letters patent, and he will call the trident yours to hold if you will hold it against his enemies. He will ask for your good swords for a year and a day, 2,000 men to keep order on his roads from the neck to the Blackwater, and ships." "We have few," Robb said. "Aye," Davos admitted, "and most pierce like goat skins if you look at them crosswise, but a promise can be delayed without being denied. He wants Joffrey Baratheon, or what remains of him, sent to the wall. He wants Cersei set to some work that breaks her pride without breaking her neck. He wants the lion tamed. For your part, he will write to the Iron Men and tell them that if ever he wins their fealty, it will start on the day they throw back what they have stolen from your shores." At the word Iron Men, something went hard and old around the table. The ravens had come from the north, and those were the worst birds Robb had ever seen, full of bad knowing. Winterfell burned and then did not burn. His brothers dead and then not dead. Theon Greyjoy prince and then traitor and then something else altogether, neither fish nor man. He had learned to sit very still to keep from shaking. "The Iron King is old," he said to Davos. "He makes trouble because he will not live to solve it." "Aye," Davos said, "and his son makes trouble because he would like to be his father. I know them. I have seen their eyes. I've seen the same eyes look out of poor men when a loaf of bread is left on a sill for cooling. It'll be worse before it's better. The question before you is whether you wish to face that worse with a lion gnawing your ankle and a Southron road at your back, neither friend nor foe, or whether you'd have the law call you soft names while your people eat and your smithies ring. The law is a stick. There are other sticks." He looked at Robb levelly over a great nose broken twice by men who did not talk when they swung. "My king will call you what you are when he has strength to be generous. He will not pretend. He has no practice, but he will deal fair." "Fair requires trust," Catelyn said. "It does," Davos agreed. "And of the two of us, only one has taken a king home in a sack and lived to give it back. I will not ask you to trust me, only to calculate." He spread his hands. "And even a fish can count to 2. They bargained, and they came to something neither side liked, which meant it was probably good. Men went out with new messages. The Manderley cogs shifted their berths. Ravens rose from the rock like flecks of night shaken into day. The Freys called a council under a tent so heavy with damp that it sagged like a cow's udder, and they said words under which were other words entirely. Walder Frey's sons made polite noises and counted their daughters, and if Robb felt the weight of eyes on his hands and throat, he hid it as best he had learned to in too short a time. He did not wed at the crag. Cybele Spicer, with her eyes like wet river stones, smiled a very small smile and put her potions back on a shelf. And Jane Westerling sewed bandages with a sore thumb and wished herself a simpler life. When word came of Bran and Rickon's false deaths, it had come too late to make a rash thing irrevocable. There was grief and anger enough, but it did not turn itself into folly. Catelyn went to the sept and left 9 candles against the stone for children who were not dead. The smoke made her eyes run. When she came out, her face looked washed. Winterfell's ruins still burned, if only in letter and memory. Theon Greyjoy had climbed some rickety ladder inside himself and fallen off. Ramsay Snow had set fire to the thing he would later call his own. Women from the Wolfswood came to White Harbor with children wrapped in their cloaks and told their stories in plain, flat voices. Wyman Manderly sent boats north with flour and salt beef. He sent men to Bear Island and Barrowton and Torrance Square with lists and small bags of coin and stout letters that said, in effect, that the world had gone crooked and what would be done about that. "The boy is your king," he told the men in the new castle when they came to argue about tariffs. "He has the rock. He will have his home." He ate another cake and tapped his cup for refilling. Robb sent Roose Bolton north with men whose names Robb's hand had written down too quickly for comfort. Ryswell men, tall hearts that had buried their lord. Hornwoods who spat when they said mill. Fergusons who did not say much at all. "Hold Moat Cailin," Robb told him. "Pinch the neck. Make it so a man would rather swim with a garrison of trout in his mail than try to take it." Bolton's eyes were cool and quiet. He bowed and promised in a voice that had no dust or salt in it, only flatness, and Robb wondered if all the candles in the Rock's halls could make that man cast a shadow bright enough to be seen. He sent the orders anyway, because commanders do as much by spills of ink as by blood, and this was the road he had chosen. Tywin finally crossed when the river skinned itself with ice like glass and men's breath came out of them in sheets like linen hung to dry. Edmure had men scrape channels, and he had men beat the ice with poles, and he had men lie on their bellies and listen for the song of water moving under the sheet. It did for some. It did not do for all. Tywin's men went over by 4s and 6s and 10s, leaving hair and flesh on the ice to pay for the god's passage. He burned Ashmark as a man slaps a thing that stings him and rode on in a fury so controlled that it made those around him cold. He had warred his whole life to keep his house's story a certain shape. He had made his father's laughter into men's fear. Now he found himself the butt of a trickster's tale. He was too serious a man to laugh and too proud a man to cry, so he did neither. He took down every flag he saw that was not red and gold and beat men who did not bend fast. He hung 3 in a row at a crossroads where the signpost showed the way to Lannisport, and when a woman tried to cut one down at night with a bread knife, she disappeared and her dog sat under the tree for 2 days and then wandered off without looking back. They found Robb on the Golden Road, where it ran through low land and then rose toward a place where 2 hills pinched it like a hand closing. The Blackfish had picked the ground as a farmer picks seed. Manderly men dug with a will. Malisters set timbers with shipwright's care. Umbers threw boulders where they would be most trouble later. They had carts drawn up into a rough half-circle and wagons chained. They had trenches and ditches and a stone quarry half-used turned to a trap. A small stream had been coaxed from its bed with a sluice of planks and now ran through the lane where the lions would come. The sun hung pale in a white sky. It was not a great battle. Great battles are made by poets. This was a hard, nasty thing of sudden arrows in fog and the wet, startled grunt a man makes when he does not understand the way his life has gone. The Lannister vanguard came in good order. Robb let them push and push again, and then he broke 2 carts and sent them tumbling sideways into the ditch and the men milling there. He had men on a bare hill with shovels, and they sent a face of earth sliding down smooth as gray porridge into the lane, and that slow flood stopped the horses who could have made a charge. Arrows found the men tugging at harness. The Umbers chose the moment when the lions had begun to break backward and roared down, huge and red-faced, and a thing like panic ran through the vanguard and out the back like a pig chased through a kitchen. Tywin's center held because all his life he had trained men that way. They did not run because the left ran. They did not run because the right ran. They stood and they chewed and they fought their bit of the meat until it broke with a noise like frozen linen. They pushed and set their shields and moved. The blackfish threw in the malisters. Wet boots on wet clay made a sound that no rumor can carry, only mud. They locked shields there in the low place and shoved until the ribs of men cracked. They shoved until a horse went up and toppled over backward onto a man who had once taken pride in how neat his beard was kept. Robb held his reserve. He felt the ground through the soles of his boots, the way old men say a farmer feels what his crop will do when he picks up a handful. When the center bowed just enough and the right of the lions bit too far forward to fill the space the left had left empty, he sent Daisy Mormont to bite behind that bite. She came like a knife cutting a tether, a small hard edge of horses and women with axes, and she set herself on the road like a stone where a stream splits. Men washed around and were cut down. They clawed back and could not move her. In the middle of the day, the sun showed definitively that it would do nothing for anyone, and then it slipped away again. A man's horse went under him without warning with a shaft driven where its belly sat soft, and he rose to his feet thinking of his father and took a step and then another and then heard, from somewhere to his right, a sound he had not heard since he was a child, the song his nurse had hummed when she wanted him to sleep. It was the Rains of Castamere, but slow, sung as a lullaby by a man who did not know he was singing it until he was halfway through. He opened his mouth to laugh, and an arrow put a second mouth where none had been intended. Tywin understood in the light between two breaths that he could not have this battle on this ground. He pulled back. He did it neatly, with squares and knots of men who had drilled until drilling was something they did in their sleep. He left 183 men behind to make the Northmen feel big and fed the horses barley hidden under sacks of dung to make his own men feel less like they were running. He took the road west and kept his face from breaking into anything but its usual blank, heavy purpose. That night he did not sleep, and the fire in his tent made the canvas glow like sickness around him. 2 days later, lordlings in Lannisport watched a sight no one then living had seen. A Lannister army approaching the rock not to triumph but to beseech. Robb had shut the gates. He had placed archers in the slits carved long ago where the wind ran like a song. He had set kettles where oil heated until it winked. He had had the timbers on the inner bridge soaked and then sprinkled with sand so a man might slip and give himself to the sea without anyone touching him. He had done all these ugly, practical things as if he were laying a table. He came out to parley on the lower terrace, where the cliff made a flat place and a low parapet where one might lean and feel the sea's breath. Gray wind paced behind him. Catelyn stood to his left, the blackfish to his right. Tywin came with Kevin and 3 household knights who looked as if they had been polished recently and without joy. He looked up and saw the black banner and did not flinch. He bowed, a little. Robb bowed a little in return. Every inch meant something, and both men measured their gifts. "You have taken what is not yours," Tywin said. He always began at the beginning with the most obvious truth, as if stating it made it consent to his order. "I have taken what you took from others," Robb said. "In another age, men tricked the Casterlys out of this place. In this age, lions devoured rains and tarbecks and sang about it afterward. There is no clean claim. There is only stone and who sits in it. Spoken like a brigand. Spoken like a man who has watched men burn my people's fields to piss them out." "You want terms," Tywin said. It was not a question. "Ido. I want a reach of peace in which to mend the north. I want my sisters brought to me. I want the trident left to Riverrun and those who owe it their bread. I want the iron men scourged from my shores or made to bend the knee. I want the name Stark spoken in the west without satire. I will hold the rock until we are agreed or until men have forgotten your name and mine." Tywin's mouth moved. His eyes did not. "You take my house and then say you will give it back when you are fat with healing. Do you know the names of the men entombed under your feet? Do you know their wives' names? The names of the brothers who starved when a mine flooded and their father would not cut timber to shore it because the timber was dear. I know the names of the girls frozen on the barrows of the shivering sea," Robb said. "I know the name of my father." For a long moment the sea and the wind spoke and the men did not. A gull wheeled like a bit of torn parchment. Kevin cleared his throat, which sounded like humility wincing. "The boy, your grace, King Robb, the world is changed. Stannis in the city, the Tyrells sniffing at each wind. We could be practical. Brother, Tywin said, without looking at him. It was a warning. Practicality, Robb said. Good. Practicality sends children to bed when the floor is cold. Practicality cuts a beast's throat when it cannot be healed. Practicality sees that the rock is only stone and the lion only a story. Tywin's jaw clenched in a way that had made men lower their eyes for 40 years. He made himself look. He looked at the boy who called himself king and saw in him something he had hoped never to suffer. The look of a man who has already paid the price for the thing he is about to do and found it coin he can spare. He shifted very slightly, toe to heel, as if to settle armor that was not heavy enough to account for the move. If I give you one sister, he said, slow and careful, what then? I will not choose between them. I am not made for that. One is at hand. One is a rumor. Then produce the one at hand and the rumor will grow legs. Give me Sansa with her maid and her clothing and a list of everything she is owed by law. The rock will hang your flag above mine for the space it takes a man to say his prayers, and I will set my men inside it to counting keys and casks. The black will come down Hen the second sister is found, or when sufficient proof is given that she is dust. I will not let you make me complicit in my own grief. Tywin looked long enough that the wind made his eyes water, and he could tell himself it was only the wind. He nodded once. The one you want least will come, then. If she comes alive, and if she comes spoken of to men as Stark and not as traitor, you will pull your beasts from my quarries and you will stop eating my grain. I will, Robb said. It took a week and a half and 100 small motions of letter and horse and ship. It took 2 small lies. One Stannis told himself about mercy and one Tywin told himself about patience. Sansa Stark came to the rock in a heavy cloak, her hair bound under a hood, mounted on a palfrey small enough to make her seem taller than she felt. She had the brittle look of a glass that has been set too near a fire. When she saw her mother, whatever held her together after the Blackwater cracked, and she made a sound that was not for anyone else but the woman whose hands made the world safe. Catelyn took her, and those watching turned their faces not for politeness but because it was a kind of prayer and it was indecent to stare at piety when it knelt. The banners shifted per the bargain. Lannister above, Stark below, and it galled men in red and it galled men in gray. It made songs, quick little improper ones that men sang under their breath as they shat. It did not change what the rock felt like when a man walked its halls. Servants still made room for a wolf in a corridor. Sentries still watched with heads that tilted to listen for a sound of howling. The Castellan learned to live with a king he had not chosen and a queen mother who had left her prayers smoldering in a tower as if the September had not been torn up from its foundations. Robb's council became a thing of moving parts set running at once. Men went north to help the work of mending. Letters sent to the Iron Bank of Bravos came back with the half-smiling civility of money that does not yet love you but could be persuaded to if you make an effort. Ramsay Snow sent missives to say he had taken Winterfell back from brigands and begged leave to garrison it for his rightful lord. Roose Bolton sent notes careful and light as a spider's web that one must not snap too quickly if one intended to see where it ran. Wyman Manderley wrote too much and then sent pies. The phrase sent a pair of youths with bland faces and soft hands to flatter the rock's servants and count the cups. Catelyn found her father's hair had gone as thin as cobwebs in the time between letters. Sansa learned the rock's ways until she could walk it with a thread unspooling in her hands and climb back to her room with the dawn. Jane Westerling came once to bring bandages to a barracks and left them and did not curtsy and returned to the crag with her lips pressed white. In later years, women would say she might have been a queen, and some would purse their mouths and say that good women make bad queens, and others would say the opposite. Cybele Spicer would grow richer. The Blackfish wasn't wrong when he called even mercy a tactic if one cared to move it so. In the end, Casterly Rock did not change anyone into a lion or a wolf. It remained stone shaped into pride. But men's memories are clay. The rock became, for a season, a place where a mother waited for 2 daughters and got one, where a boy wore a Bear Island woman's old words like a glove. Might as well say I'm a bear of the trident, Daisy told him, laughing in the dust of the yard after she dunked him in the trough when he took a practiced blow too gently, and where old griefs had room to turn on themselves and face the room with their backs for once. Winter carried itself down from the high blue with small busy steps. Snow came to rustle in the courtyard corners. Sleet painted the parapets with glass. Men's hands cracked. The sea put up its winter shoulders and shoved at the cliff as if to remind the rock who had cut it all those holes that made hidden stairs and privy shafts. The raven that brought word that Arya had been seen near the trident had feathers missing from one wing and made a mess of the rookery before he'd be caught. Sansa lit a candle and said a prayer and then sat in a dark window until the candle ate itself. Tywin made one last effort, because a man whose story has been tidy will always make one last effort to scrub a stain from it. He came in from the north at night, through rain that came down not in drops but in cows' tails, and he tried to set ladders against a part of the rock where the cliff stood less proud. He sent men to die to test whether wolves had learned to loosen themselves with the comfort of fire and meat. He found that wolves fed better but slept lighter. Gray wind went among the ladders like a rumor with teeth. The men drawn from Lannisport who had begun to think that these gray strangers might be fairer masters than their old ones found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with their strangers and feeling a thing that might become loyalty grow like an ache in the breast. At dawn, Tywin sat his horse 2 miles away and looked at the rock long enough to make his eyes sore. "It's only stone," Kevin said gently. Tywin shook his head. "Once. It is what men say about it. It is the song." There were songs already, and more were being made. Some would live, and some would die, as all songs do. Men would sing about the day the wolf looked out from the lion's window and the sea itself took a breath to listen. In one of those songs, a boy with a name forgotten would be the one to lift the keys that day in the lower vaults and open the old door while the Blackfish watched. In another, it would be the Blackfish himself who did it, for men prefer their heroes ready carved. Robb Stark tried to hold nothing so tightly that it broke to get away. He rode the western roads and took measure of the men who had called lions lord. He ate bread baked in pans stamped with sooty lions and did not make a show of turning the loaves over. He watched gold going out of the rock's treasury to pay smiths in the riverlands to set straight bent swords and nails. He measured how much of himself could be given over to the making of peace without emptying himself of war. He had taken the rock. That was a strike. He had not taken his own home back. That was a wound. He learned to live with the one in the presence of the other. When at last he rode north again, it was in a winter light that made every color something else. He left the Blackfish behind with 2,000 men, and the Blackfish was content, for a man who has spent his life in the war of others finds an odd comfort in garrisoning a legend. "Do not start a collection of lion heads," Robb told him, smiling the smallest of smiles. "I'll put my knife in their purses, not their crowns," the Blackfish said. "Hell's boy, go home." Robb went as far as Moat Cailin with 5,000 footing their way through the next wet, sly wastes, and their Roose Bolton met him with the kind of orderliness that men confuse with virtue. He had held. He had made the swamps the allies they had always been, and the planks of the moat's fractured causeways the instruments of other men's deaths. He had not warmed himself, which was a thing he was good at. He made bows and nods and offered counsel, and Robb took it in pieces and let other pieces slide away as if he had not heard them. Ramsay Snow stood back and smiled with a mouth that did not know what to do with its corners. Robb kept an eye on him and went on to Winterfell. The seat of the Starks lay with a ring of ash around it like the shadow of a crown. It looked more itself than it had in any of Robb's memories. Stones stood where stones had stood when the first men had still thought the children of the forest would come and make their faces into smiling knots in the weirwood. He stood at the gates and put his palm to the iron, and the cold moved up his arm like a thought. He found the godswood where he had left it, which is a miracle all men should be able to count on. He knelt there and closed his eyes in a place where the world still made sense, and after a long while he rose and began the long business of mending a thing broken not by one blow but by many. West, the rock kept its own counsel. The sea pushed and pulled. In Lannisport, mothers told children a new story, about a time when a gray banner hung under a red one for a season and nothing fell out of the sky and no gods came from the west in a boat of water. Men went into the mines and came up white as ghosts with gold dust clinging to sweat, and they called the dust lion's kiss like they always had, and if sometimes they said it more softly, that was only because they wanted their luck to hear them. In King's Landing, Stannis made a new sort of city out of the old by the slow art of setting rows of dominoes upright again faster than boys could run through them and shout. He sent a letter to the rock with a seal in black wax and a signature that had no flourish and less grace. It named Robb Stark Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North and Lord Paramount of the Trident, on condition of good behavior and the keeping of roads passable for a king's men, such men being leaner and less handsome than the men in such titles always imagine. He sent Davos north one more time, and Davos went as willingly as a tide. They met again on the high gallery where the window made light that forgave people their faces. Davos held his hands on the rail and looked at the sea as if it could be persuaded to be kind. "I never wanted to be this cold again," he said, without rancor. "Nor I," Robb said. He had thicker on him now, callous and patience both. "You paid a dear price for a story," Davos said. He meant the story that would be told about the day a boy took a house older than songs by a road older than any map. "Everything costs dear when you buy it for people and not for yourself," Robb said, and found it true when he said it. They talked of roads and levees and the kind of law a winter can hold. They talked of Iron Men and of a man named Jon Snow holding a wall that had ideas about its own age. They placed between them the least of their pride and touched it lightly. And outside, in the cold, the sea moved as it had moved under Casterly Rock before any man had thought of calling himself lion or wolf or anything but a thing that needed to bring a boat to shore. Time did what time will do. It thickened around the memories that had hurt like a raw place in the mouth and made them into something a tongue could press and feel a dull ache and not flinch. Sansa learned to make her voice useful. Arya, when she arrived, when she slid into their hall like a blade pulled from a sheath by a hand the hall did not see, laughed at the rock and ran away to its highest terraces to look down at the sea that tried and tried at the cliff and never felt itself ashamed for failing. She told her brother how to move when a man with a big sword wanted to make you move for him, and he laughed and said he would try it at the next parley. When at last the black banner came down and the lion went back up alone, it was not a defeat but the keeping of a contract. Men grumbled because men always do. Householders counted coin and were surprised to find themselves not poor enough to sing about it in the doorway of a tavern. The Castellan wrote a letter to a cousin in Fair Isle in which he described the particular smell of a northern dog and how it strung a man's past across his present until both looked like a net hung to dry. He was not a poet. The letter made his cousin tear up anyway. Robb stood on the terrace where once he had stood across from Tywin and felt the same wind in his hair. He put a hand on the stone and then on the wolf that stood carved at his feet. Some long-dead mason's fancy, as if the place had known without knowing how that this would come to pass. He said nothing to the sea. He did not thank the stone. He walked back into the dark-lit corridors with his men and left the rock to its own silence. On the road east, he met his people going west. They had carts loaded with iron and rumor and winter stores salted enough to keep. They had hope that had been fed on more than songs. They cheered him, and he took the cheer as a man who owns his ears, not as a man who thinks he owns the throats that make the sound. In the castle that had been his father's, he set the first new stone in a wall that had known too much fire. He laid it as carefully as a man sets a child's head on a pillow. Other men took up other stones. The sound of mending began and went on. Deep under Casterly Rock, in a place of old air and older bones, water fell in the steady drip that is the difference between forever and a long time. No man heard it and no man needed to. Above, in the halls, there were footsteps going and then gone. A banner had hung, black and white and clean as a winter midnight under stars, and then it had been folded and put away. In the mind of men, that banner still moved a little, as if in some wind that existed only in memory. In the spring that would come when spring was ready, the people of the West would tell children how once a wolf came to their cliff and looked down with gray eyes and did not blink. And in the north, when the wind curled round a hill and bit a man's ear, he would pull his cap down and say to himself that there had been a day when no one outside Winterfell would have believed a boy with a sword could worry a lion in its den and live to tell. He would smile, small, and put his hands to his work. Snow fell the way ash falls after a great burning, quietly and everywhere at once, making every surface into a page that could be written upon and then erased by the next gust of wind. The ravens at Winterfell found roosts on familiar ledges as if some piece of their own memory had drawn them back. The rookery's steps were swept, and a new maester, thin, serious, with a mouth that knew how to say no, carried messages up and down like a man walking with goblets full of light. Men hammered a rhythm into the day, nails ringing, mallets thudding. In the gods' wood the pond breathed out faint steam, and the red leaves had collected their winter wet into 1,000 jewels that slid and fell and were replaced. Robb took to walking the walls before dawn, the habit of a commander who had been too tired to sleep and too stubborn to admit it made into a bit of kingly ritual. Gray wind went with him when the mood took. Sometimes the dire wolf would lift his head and scent the air and rumble deep in his chest, and Robb would rest a hand behind his ear and feel the vibration in his own bones. "You're listening to something older than me," he would say, and the wolf would blink as if such a thing did not require saying. Sansa learned the paths of Winterfell like the paths of a song, from the lower bakehouse where bread came out with dark shoulders to the high walk over the first keep where the wind came straight out of the east with the bite of iron in it. She wore cloaks heavy enough to let her stand in the cold until her cheeks stung and her lips went numb, and she forced herself to stand. The place remembered her father kindly. It did not remember her. She made it remember. When Brienne of Tarth came through the gate one morning with snow in her hair and a boy with black eyes at her stirrup, Podrick Payne, steady and perplexed, Tyrion Lannister had sent him north with a half-healed limp and a letter. Sansa met them in the yard and hugged Brienne like a sister she had invented for herself. The big woman blushed to the ears and tried to kneel and made a mess of both gestures. "Stand," Sansa told her softly. "There's too much winter for kneeling." Arya took to the yards as if they were a forest. She had grown into a lean thing with new strength in her wrists and an impatience that had learned how to be still in the way a cat is still, ready to become motion at the touch of a thought. She whistled to the hounds and climbed where she was told not to climb and haunted the gatehouse until Hullen's boy, Tall Tom, gave up telling her no. She found her way to the kitchens and stood within the steam and the clatter and learned which cook had which humor and how to get an extra onion without seeing a wooden spoon. At night she lay on her back and stared at the low ceiling and saw a different ceiling she had slept under in a barn, then a hall, then a cave, then under a hedge, and she put the different ceilings in a line and counted them and let the counting take her away to sleep. Letters made a web around them all, a net that caught rumor and need and turned both into obligation. Roose Bolton's neat hand came from the moat with the measured calm of a man making inventories. He had held, he said. The neck was a patient ally, the crannogman tireless in the dirty work of harrying. Ryswells had sent men and so had the Dustons, the Glovers, the Tallhearts, each with a little curl of pride in the way their names were spelled by another man's pen. Ramsay Snow wrote too, in an untidy script that made the words look as if they'd been whipped out of an angry child. He had reclaimed Winterfell from brigands, he said, this before the Starks came home, and he had put order to their wickedness with law. Robb read that letter until the paper had gone soft where his fingers lay. He did not believe it, no more than he would have believed snow if it told him it had fallen upward. He put the letter aside and kept its shape in his head. The sea kept sending them news from the south. Men came in with salt stiff in their beards, men who knew tar and the way a rope talks when it's about to break. They brought word of Stannis making a city out of a broken city by lifting a piece here and propping a piece there and beating 10 men for every man he praised until the 10 men became 100 and the city grew a spine that did not bend in the same places as before. They told of new judges with clean hands and lean stomachs and of jailers afraid of their own shadows because shadows could be men with warrants now. They told how Cersei drank and how she was made to walk in a narrow yard for an hour each day around a patch of winter herbs, and how Joffrey, all spiders and sneers, had been sent north in black and gray with a sword too heavy for his wrist and a name that stuck in his throat when he tried to say it. Brother. Stannis did it, Arya said, sitting on the edge of the training yard rail with her heels knocking the post, a softness in her voice that was not mercy. He sent him to the wall. He held a sword, Sansa murmured. Once, there were days when he looked at it like it was a dog that had bitten him. Dogs bite for reason, Arya said, and hopped down and went to find a scandalized Ser Roderick's stand-in to ask for a heavier practice blade. Robb's council grew around a long table made by men who had cut their furniture from fallen stair tread. Solid, a bit warped at one end, honest. The Great John punched the knots in it with a forefinger as big as a child's wrist and left little crescent dents. Wyman Manderly's son Ser Wylis sat where his father could not, a man with good sense and a softness around the eyes that hid iron. Meege Mormont wrote rough-chopped letters from Bear Island when she could and sent daughters when she could not. And Daisy stood by the window, arms folded, giving the weather her own look as if she could shame it into snowing elsewhere. "We can mend throughout winter," Ser Wylis said, reading from a list. "But if we would hunters have something more than soup and poor venison come deep cold, we'll need Manderly boats to run the knife and bring up salt fish. I have men that see, and do it, and skiffs that can laugh in the face of ice, your grace, but we'll need order on the coast. The iron men still take a sheep when they see one. They take children," murmured a woman in the shadows behind Caitlin. Hallie's Hornwood's widow, alone in her chair, her hands cracked from work she had not thought to do with her own skin at this age. "They take, and we break their fingers." The Great John thumped the table again, and a little powder of sawdust rose. "Your Grace, give me leave to put umber boots on every island beach between the lonely light and the white knife. I'll make the krakens crawl home on their bellies." "We cannot be everywhere at once," Robb said. "The sea makes too many roads. We must take a few, close others, make the iron men choose, and then punish them for that choosing." He looked to the window where the snow smeared the view and made the yard into a soft, colorless shape. "When the passes open enough, I will go to the twins." The room stilled a little around that sentence, as if the walls found something in it to consider. "You will marry," Caitlin said. The words were neither question nor command, but a place in the air to stand. "I swore," Robb said. "It is not the thing I would pick for myself. There are no things I would pick for myself. But if a man calls me king and I call him friend and then cut him out of a bargain because it had grown sour, what have I built that will stand?" "They will not greet you with sweetmeats," Wylis said with a flicker in his eye that might have been sympathy. "Lord Walder's courtesies are bones with a bit of meat left on them for the pleasure of gnawing." "I have enough teeth for that," Robb answered, "and the bite will be mine as well as his." When the caravan went south, it went like a snake sliding over ice, slow at first, then more sure, men and wagons and ropes and the steady resentment of oxen. The banners wrote lines in the air that the wind tried to rub out. At the Green Fork the ice sulked but held, groaning as men walked it like a living thing that would charge rent if it thought to. Riverrun's walls rose through a wet fog, and Edmure came out on the outer ward in a cloak that made him look younger than grief had made him, and embraced his sister with a politeness that had not been theirs when they were children. Robb listened as his uncle told him the dozen small insults Harrenhal had handed him in his absence, as if the castle had learned pride from a lord long dead and intended to keep it with the same cranky selfishness. They went on. The twins squatted upon the river like a fat man straddling a plank. They had never looked like anything but that, even when the sun softened them and summer made their bricks smile. Now the snow had found every leaky place and made it into a whiteness, and the towers looked like old men in bad wigs. At the gate, a servant with a wart like a tiny beetle upon his cheek bowed and showed too many teeth. "My lord will be pleased," he lied. Walder Frey received them in a hall that smelled of damp wool and onion. He was thinner and somehow larger, in the way a wound becomes larger when it refuses to heal. He called Robb boy once and measured the weight of the silence that followed and did not do it again. The women were a row of colors on a bench, 15 shades of resignation from bright to drab. Roslyn was among them, small, with hands like folded birds. She lowered her eyes as a woman taught carefulness will and looked up once quickly and then down again. Caitlin watched her as if she were a bit of glass in sunlight. "My daughters," Walder said with a cynic's flourish of pride. "Pieces on the board. You've upset the play, boy. Perhaps you're good at games." "I'm better at keeping my word," Robb said. "I have come to take a wife from your house, and I will honor her and keep her. I have brought gifts. I have brought my oath. If I must bring my sword into this hall, the fault will not be mine and the songs will say I was polite before I was angry." Walder's mouth did a thing it had not done willingly for years. It made an honest smile, thin as the lace on a badly kept cuff. Polite before angry, he mused. That's a remedy I've not heard for anything that ails. And you'll take Rosalind. Sweet little thing. We'll lose a harp from the household and gain a winter scarf for your bed. My loss. My gain, Robb said, and the hall heard the way he set the words down, not as a man resigned but as a commander marking a point on a map and moving the piece to it. They married on a day that sun found without warmth. The sept smelled of old wax and new breath. Rosalind's veil was light and useless against the cold, and her lips had gone the color of plums in the frost. She spoke clearly anyway. Robb's voice had the steadiness he had found in himself on a dozen mornings he had wanted to throw up before calling the march. Walder Frye made a show of being moved and dabbed his eyes with a cloth he found in his sleeve and then put away with the precise care of a man inventorying his last resources. There was feasting. No man was killed. Soup was salty. The meat had that sour-sweet tang of onion saved too long and boiled twice. The pastry lids were stout enough to stop a good arrow. Men drank moderately because they had been warned and because they were not fools. Women sang once, a small pretty thing about a woman whose tears turned to pearls and sank, and Robb put his hand over Rosalind's for the third time in a day and felt how very small that hand was and how the bones in it stood close to the skin. After, Walder held Robb's wrist and counted the pulses with his thumb, as if to make sure the boy was alive and not some trick of light. I knew your father's face, he said. I did not know his son would wear it so plainly. He is dead, Robb said. I am not done being his son. Walder released him, and his thumb left a pale print that filled with blood. We shall see, he said, with an air of having seen too much already and found none of it worth the trouble. On the ride away, the twins looked no more gracious in the rearward view. Robb and Rosalind rode side by side for a while in a silence men tried to pretend they did not hear. Then Rosalind spoke, not to fill the space but because the words had been trapped in her throat and needed air. I play the harp, she said, and a little viol. I embroider badly. I can sew well enough to help a wounded man. I have never seen the sea. Robb looked at her, at the profile that would be thought pretty by men who liked small things, at the bright grit in the corner of her eye where she had refused to rub tears away because it would have made her nose red. Winterfell has no sea, he said. But it has a wind that smells clean, and a god's wood that makes a sound like breath when it snows, and a kitchen that will bake pies for no reason other than that there is flour and lard and an afternoon that wants using. If you like music, Daisy Mormont knows a song no man of good sense likes and sings it too loudly. Rosalind smiled, a cautious thing that gathered courage from being allowed existence. I will bring my harp, she said. I will be useful if I can be. He gave her that courtesy. You will be my wife, he said. If that is not useful enough, I will adjust my measures. Word rode before them and behind them like outriders going too fast and too slow by turns. In White Harbor, Wyman Manderly read a Stannis letter twice and smiled into his cup in a way that made his son and brother both nervous. He had in his great belly a great patience. He had been insulted and cheated and made to kneel to men whose boots were not worthy of his own mud. He had kept his temper and his coin, and now he could spend both with interest. Davos Seaworth, he said, practicing the sound of the name as if it were some pastry whose name he could not remember. He will come to me, and I will send him somewhere he will be himself. Davos did come, a little thinner than a man ought to be in winter, and with a look about the eyes that spoke of long watches and of counting, always counting. Wyman received him in a hall warmed by braziers that smoked a little and made a sweet stink when the fat of some roast caught them. The Merman's Court did what the Merman's Court always did. It pretended to be a proper court and was actually a counting house with delusions of anthem. You are the Onion Knight, Wyman said in a tone one reserves for a man one intends to treat well after making him work for it. I am, Davos said. I am also tired, my lord, and hungry if you have it to spare, and I bear the words of King Stannis. We have all those things in White Harbor, Wyman said and clapped his hands. Men brought food and wine and letters. Davos ate with a soldier's gratitude, one eye always on the table's edges where the next bit of news might slip over and fall. They spoke of law and roads and the price of salt beef. They spoke of ships with low draft and mean hearts that could run the shallows where bigger craft would give themselves their own graves. They spoke of winter and about how men make worse enemies in winter because hunger gives them a talent for cruelty. At the end, Wyman leaned forward with a breath that smelled of wine and meat and frankness. "My lord, you are a good man. The North has need of good men who can sail. The North has need of a boy." "Your words are wisps," Davos said gently. "Not after this," Wyman said. "Rickon Stark. He lives." Davos felt the room go a little far away and then return. "Where?" he said, and then softly, "As men say the name of a sea they do not love, Skagos." "Aye," Wyman said, "cannibals in their furs. Men who share wives and eat their enemies and worship gods that never learned people's names. They took him and Osha. Not took as a thief takes, but took as a bank takes coins. To keep, to use, to return enriched. Or to lose, if misfortune takes a hand." He eyed Davos. "You were a smuggler. You have gone where men told you not to. You can go where a lord's name will not open a door." "I can," Davos said. "And if I come back with him, what then?" "Then I will bake you a pie," Wyman said gravely, and his eye glittered like a cat's. "A very particular pie. And the North will have a proper feast." He did not explain the pie. He did not need to. There had been fry men who had come to White Harbor and sat too straight and ate too much and made too free with a certain tone in their voices. There had been fry men who had left by the postern with their heads bowed and the smell of fear in their clothes. White Harbor had ways of forgetting that were not recorded in any book. Davos had a long memory for unrecorded things. He agreed without asking more of the recipe. On the day he sailed, Wyman waddled down to the dock to watch the little ship push her bow into black water that held the reflections of the city's lights and gave them back with no favor. "Bring the boy home," he said, "and mind the winds between here and there. They are not men's winds." "They never were," Davos said and went. In the west, a man died the way some castles die. From a small crack that had been there so long it was not seen as a crack anymore. Tywin Lannister sat at a desk carved with leaves and lions' faces and wrote a letter in a hand that had become ungenerous and then held very still with his quill hovering, as if he were listening to a sound he could not quite make out. The fire in the hearth made a sound like a child gritting its teeth. Kevin would later say that his brother had looked well that afternoon, which meant only that he had looked like himself. Color like a blowsy apple, temper like a stone. A servant came and laid a document beside the one Tywin was writing and withdrew as if backing away from a lion he had been told would not bite. Tywin finished his sentence, put a full stop with great care, and then took a breath that did not do for him what he had meant it to do. He set the quill down. He did not fall. He did not announce his death with any melodrama. He simply did not finish the next breath as he had begun it. When Kevin came into the room an hour later, Tywin's head was tipped as if he were considering the paper still, and the candle beside him had burned a little gutter into the wax and made a smell like tallow and old skin. The lion banners went down half a day, then up again. In Lannisport there were tears, honest ones, and boasts, honest ones, and a sense among those who keep ledgers that interest had come due and would be called. Kevin took the reins because he had always taken them when asked. He did not laugh. He did not make songs. He sent quiet men to quiet places and told them to watch. Cersei in King's Landing was already a ghost in a tower by then. Stannis had taken from her everything that had made her a queen and left her only the things that made her a woman, and then made even those into instruments of penance. Jaime Lannister still sat in Riverrun with iron on his wrists. Edmure Tully visited him once each week with a face composed of equal parts disgust and interest, the way a man looks at a wolf in a cage at a fair. They spoke of nothing and everything. Jaime did not say, "There are parts of me that love a fight more than a woman." He did not say, "I remember pushing a boy because I did not know where to put the love I had for my sister." He learned instead to hold his tongue and count the bones in his hands when he could not sleep. The Iron Men did not wait for anyone's grief to pass. Balon Greyjoy fell from a rope bridge on a night when the wind made the rope sound like a harp string. The sea took him back without comment. On the deck of a ship coming out of the far west, A man with blue lips and a smile like oil pulled tight over a bucket of knives felt the world tilt back toward him and laughed into the dark. At Pike, Asha stood among uncles and cousins and men whose skin had been stirred by salt since birth and made her case as clean and practical as a good knot. They could not hold the North where it did not want to be held. They could take the sea where it always had been theirs. They could live fat on fish and lean on honor or die thin on pride and rotten meat. A man with a stained eye patch spoke of dragons no one had seen. A priest with a damp humor poured water on men's heads. In the end, the Isle's law chose neither sense nor mad speculation but a path between. First the grin with knives and then the clever girl, and behind them a great ship with the memory of iron in her timbers going to fetch a queen from far away who would never love them. North, Asha sent a bird anyway. A plain feathered thing that had been carried in a boy's sleeve and hid there the way a shamed coin hides in a poor man's seam. It found its way to Barrowton and then to Winterfell, and Robb read it with his jaw set the way his father's had been set when he'd had to tell a man he would hang for murder done in a field over a pair of boots. "She will bargain," he said, looking at Catelyn over the paper. "She will give us men, honest men who would rather fish than rob, and pledge to keep the stony shore and the rills clear of her own. In return she wants leave to keep the 10 Towers and Harlaw fat, and for us to call off our hounds." "The sea makes its own law," Catelyn said. "If she keeps her men in their boats, I can forgive their father's sins. If, we will make the if into a word she has to say every morning before she eats," Robb said. He wrote back in his own hand, the letters straight, the words exact. He offered Asha terms a hungry woman could accept and a proud one could live with. He did not write her name as Yara. That had never been her name here. Roose Bolton's letters lost what little warmth they had and came in with a brittle crispness like pan ice in a pail. He wanted men. He wanted appointment. He wanted to be the hand in the North that could be trusted to do the necessary poor work men praise when done and curse while it's being done. Robb sent him men and held back others. He nodded toward trust and laid snares around it in the form of errands that required other men's eyes. To Meej Mormont he wrote an order and a plea in one: watch Bolton's hunt. "He has a way of looking at a man as if he were already skinned," Robb told Daisy when she brought him Bear Island's reply. "I trust him to find the right quarry. I do not trust him to report where he dragged it and why. When the first spring thaw made the whole world into a stew of mud and relief, word came soft-footed as a fox to the hard places of the North. Ramsay Snow had retaken the Dreadfort and made it his. Not by war against his father, Bolton was not so simple a man as to set a son openly against him, but by quiet accretion of men who liked pain and obedience and the smell of their own power. That letter did not announce itself. It arrived folded into a report about tithes. Robb unfolded it and read the small part that had in it the seed of the end of patience. "He holds thee in grey joy," the report added, almost as an afterthought, like a mother telling her child she had found a lost glove whose pair had already been replaced. Alive, changed. Theon's name had been a stone in Robb's mouth for a year, sometimes a kindness, sometimes a broken tooth he worried with his tongue until it bled. Catelyn found him in the Godswood with the letter in his hand and the look on his face of a man standing on ice that might hold if he did not breathe and would certainly not if he tried to walk. "We will take him," she said, because she understood that sometimes a mother does not say the sensible thing. She says the true thing. The siege of the Dreadfort began not like a siege but like a winter hunt. Men slipping through the stunted trees, fat gray rabbits bolting, a gull up from the river with a fish in its mouth that was still alive and twisting. The castle squatted on its knoll like a cow that had come down into the yard instead of staying to calve in the field. Its walls were old and mean. Its towers had been added to whenever a man with a talent for cruelty had found a spare summer. It had a stink to it of tanneries and old meat. Robb set men to dig where the low places were and to throw up earth where the towers could be most easily made to look stupid. He told the Manderley engineers to build him engines that would not rot their own ropes in the damp. He sent a boy in a brown cloak as if to sell onions and then watched through a lens as the boy walked the inner yard and counted steps and kicked at places where other men had kicked and felt no satisfaction and then left. Bolton's men inside were the sort of men who whistle when they sharpen their knives. They watched the siege begin with interest rather than fear. as if it were a pageant laid on for their entertainment. Ramsay himself came to the wall once and looked down with his head tipped and his mouth twisted the way a man's mouth twists when he is tasting something he wants to like out of politeness. He waved at Daisy, who stood in a row of women with spears on a low ridge, and she raised her axe and planted it like a flag in the frozen ground between her feet and stared at him until he turned away to hide his blink. It was ugly work, the slow ringing of stones against stones, the creak and complaint of timbers. The stink of men's cold breath turned into something like soup in their beards. Robb slept badly and watched well. On the 7th night, a Manderley device that had spent 5 days looking like nothing more than a pile of wet wood and sulk lifted its arm and put a stone into the angle of wall where the mortar had been mixed with too much sand by a man who thought to save his lord 2 pennies on lime. The stone did not bring the wall down. It brought down belief in the wall. The 2nd stone made men think about their wives. The 3rd made someone inside begin to pray loudly enough for those outside to hear. They found the postern that had once been used to bring in pigs without bringing the stink of pigs through the great gate. The Crannogmen had a talent for mud and secrets. 3 men went in, 2 came back. The 3rd had his throat opened from behind in the dreamless dark by someone who had been waiting all his life to do that to someone. Robb considered stopping and did not. Practicality cuts a beast's throat when it cannot be healed. He ordered the assault as the pale light before dawn made every face into a blank coin with 2 eyes stamped in. They went in with ropes and small ladders and the intimate terror of narrow places. Arrows made a noise like bees that had been taught to hate. A man named Small John got his name a 2nd time when he ran 2 men together into a wall with his shoulder and broke the wall before he broke their ribs. Ramsay's men came on giggling and were stopped giggling by death, which does not enjoy jokes. Within, there were rooms with hooks and rooms with water stains like maps, and rooms with beds that had been slept in by men who did not know what pity was for. Theon was in a place of stone that had forgotten how to be warm. They found him by the smell first, then by a sound that was not a voice and not the doing of an animal, then by a face. "He is mine," Robb said when Daisy would have lifted him. He went to his knees on a floor where uneaten food lay in little rot piles. He put his hands on Theon's shoulders and felt bones under a skin that had decided to give up and keep to itself. "Theon," he said, speaking a name the way a man will speak into a horn to see if it will return his own voice. "Theon." The eyes that moved toward him were eyes that had been trained to look for blows and not bread. The mouth did not know what shape to make. The fingers twitched with the memory of ropes. Theon made a sound like a bird caught in a chimney. It might have been rob. It might have been kill. It might have been nothing that could be spelled. Robb put his forehead to Theon's and breathed, and Grey Wind, who had come where no direwolf should have had patience enough to come, laid himself along the doorway with a care that had no purpose anyone could explain and made the air honest. Ramsay fled into his father's absence and found it would not hide him. The battle in the yard was at once feral and arranged, like all good traps. Roose Bolton had taught his son things that a man ought not teach any other creature. He had not taught him to read a room when the room had men in it who knew what they were about. An arrow, then another. A horse down. A scream that made a circle of space around it and could be stepped into or around. Daisy found Ramsay when the man's boot slipped on a patch of blood that had frozen into a gloss like varnish. She did not give him speech. She did not give him ceremony. She gave him the blunt kindness she had for animals that had got into a bad way. A fast death that cut off his face while it was still arranging itself to beg, because there was nothing in that face she needed to hear. After, Roose came riding in with an escort whose spears were carefully clean. He looked upon the ruin as if it were a ledger and then upon his son as if the entries there had been an annoyance that was finally balanced. "Your Grace," he said to Robb with a depth to his bow that read as sarcasm until one noticed the stillness in his eyes. "No malice, no fear, nothing at all. You've done my house a service. My boy was in need of better education." "Your boy was an abomination," Robb said, and the words made a thing in the air between them that would either be a bridge or a knife. Roose lifted his gaze to that thing and considered. "Abominations thrive in winter if men grow inattentive. You were attentive." He looked at Theon, who had been wrapped in furs and lifted as if he were a saint's reliquary to be taken home. "This one will live?" he asked mildly. "He will," Robb said. "Then see to it," Roose said. "He has a father, for good or ill. Fathers do not accept a corpse when there's a man to be had for ransom, and we are short on gold." He smiled, and in that expression there was the entire winter of the North. Lean, narrow, necessary. We always are. He did not betray. Not that day. Not that season. He went home to the Dreadfort's cleaned halls and a new habit of silence there, and the North learned to be wary of men who did not warm their hands over their own cook fires. The wall wrote its own letter to Winterfell in a script of black upon white. A raven came with ice in the feathers, too exhausted to fight the hand that took it, and when the message was opened, the words made a clean fear in even the men who had seen battle. Wildlings south of the wall. Not a raid, not a jaunt to steal sheep and girls, but a people, a tide. Giants, horns, fire in the trees. A name written without care for how it would sound to men who had never said it. Mance. Jon Snow's name was in the letter as well, not by its letters. It was in the way the message came at all, and how it had been made to live through cold long enough to reach a hand that would read it. It was in the phrase, "castle held," in the flat men on the east wall taking turns by hour, in the little hard knot of words near the end that read like a jaw clenching, "We do not have enough." It was a thing you could hear if you had listened to his voice as a boy on a practice yard with sweat on his brow. Robb did not deliberate long. He took a part of the host he had put together to break the Dreadfort and turned it toward the great white line in the north, as if it were not a wall but a wound that needed holding closed by living hands. "The wall fed us when winter taught our grandfathers humility," he told those who resented going. "We will feed it now, and if we are clever and not proud, we will let it feed us again in ways we do not yet see." The march north had the particular misery of a thing done because it is necessary and not because it is glorious. Men's piss turned to smoke before it hit the ground. Bread broke teeth. Wind put a knife in every seam. They joked because they were Northmen and because jokes are winter's little fires. They came upon abandoned crofts with doors ajar, and small things within that made men swallow and step back out without names for what they felt. They saw no wolves. They saw once a trail of something that had been a man and was now a drag through snow that had not cared to fill itself up behind him. Castle black hoisted signals that meant what they had always meant. "We live, we need." Smoke lay along the ground like a sleeping beast and then lifted as the wind found a mind. The wall itself made Robb feel small enough to be safe from every human piece of arrogance. He stood beneath it and let his head tip back and then forced it back down. "Men built this," he said softly to no one and everyone, "and now men will mend it or die under it." Jon Snow met him on the yard with his face raw and his eyes bright. He had a man's stance and a boy's hunger and something in him that had been forged by hard hands into a blade not yet named. They did not embrace right away. They measured. Then Arya ran between them and did the embracing for both, springing up to catch Jon around the neck and scolding him for not writing and then scolding him again for writing such poor letters. "You did not say what the giants looked like," she accused. "Like men big enough to pull a tree up and use it for a walking stick," Jon said, grinning with that sudden, reckless light that made him again the boy by the window at Winterfell watching snow. Robb clapped his brother's shoulder and felt in the muscle there that all the distance between bastardy and kingship is a word and not a wall. "Tell me," he said. They went into a cold room that had been made warm with straw and men and stale beer and laid the pieces out as men lay a net on a beach to see where it will catch and where it will tear. Mance's numbers, the giant's placement, the mammoths that made the earth thrum, the thin line of men on the wall who had not slept enough to dream. "If we hold the gate and the top," Jon said, "the wall is a thing. If they take either, it is a story." "We know stories," Robb said. "We live in one these days. Let's make this one clean." The battle that followed was a series of small salvations. Men brought up barrels and set them on fire and rolled them down with yells that made them brave because they sounded brave. Arrows fell thin at first and then heavy, and men learned to duck and then forgot as the heat of the work took their heads. Giants came like trees walking, and men were allowed to do the thing that will make a man until the day he dies. They were allowed to be afraid and act anyway. Robb stood on the walkway with the wind cutting his face and heard gray wind howl below in a yard full of unfamiliar smells and thought. In a tiny corner of his mind he kept for these thoughts, that he had become everything he had never wished to be and that it had not killed him. He gave orders that were clever and orders that were obvious and learned to love obvious orders because men obeyed them more willingly. Joffrey Baratheon Waters / whatever name men will let you have came up the inner stairs with 3 men behind him to the top of the wall and looked out with a face that had worn 2 expressions all his life and now tried on a third. He was thin and angry and cold and so far from his mother that he could not use her hair like a cord to pull himself out of the corner he had made for himself. He had the sense to stand where he was told. He did not have the sense to keep his mouth shut. "Kill them," he hissed, as if a single word could animate an army. "Kill them all." "We're trying," Jon said evenly, standing 2 steps away, his eyes and mind on the yard below where men were trying to move a kettle under fire. "Then shoot." Joffrey spat at an archer near him and reached for the man's bow. The archer took it back with 2 fingers and a look that would have made a less ignorant boy step back. Joffrey put his hand on his sword. He drew it halfway and felt the blade catch in the cold. He yanked awkwardly and shook the ice off it. The movement put his foot on the wrong board. The wrong board had gone soft where last summer's rain had found it and this winter's cold had made it brittle. It snapped like a lie cut too fine. Joffrey's leg plunged through up to the thigh and stuck. He screamed. Not words, not outrage, but the sound a man makes when his body betrays him while the world watches. Jon moved on instinct. He dropped his bow and went to him, crouched, grabbed him under the arms as if bracing a friend and not a creature who would have had him whipped. "Stop fighting me," he said into the boy's ear, and some place in Joffrey that liked to live more than it liked to be obeyed did as it was told. Together they pulled him up and out, his leg tearing free with a sound like a glove pulled off a sweaty hand. He stood, gasping, his eyes wild, his sword still in his hand like a stupid idea that had survived its usefulness. An arrow took him. It came out of the hard white updraft at an angle that men who study wind will never be able to teach other men to love. It hit him in the hollow where neck meets shoulder like a friend, sank into him like betrayal. He made a noise like a deer that has realized what it is to be prey, and then the boy king who had been stripped of kingship and pride and most things that had made him himself went down on the boards with blood doing the work blood does. He died not well and not badly. He died as men die in winter, undramatically, with a great effort of the body that leaves the air looking the same after it is over as it looked before. Jon's mouth tightened into a line that would be familiar on him later. He took off his glove and put his fingers to the boy's throat and then, quietly, drew the lids down over eyes that had been too often open in cruelty. "Back to work," he said, as men do when grief is a luxury they cannot afford. And they did. The wildlings broke themselves. They did not do it gladly. They did it because a wall 10 men tall is a different thing than a wall 30 men tall, and because giants die too and mammoths flame when oil finds their lashes. Mance fell back, and the fall became a run not out of fear but out of recognition of the arithmetic. They would come again. That was written in the way the sun rose and men die. For a time, a little time, the world north of the world reminded itself of where the lines ought to be. After, Robb walked the walkway with Jon and looked down where the fires had been and saw a figure lifted and carried under a blanket and did not ask a question that did not need asking. "He was a boy," he said instead, and the words were not mercy. They were inventory. "He was," Jon said. "He died like a boy who had been asked to be a man all his life and never learned the lesson." "Stannis will like that badly," Robb said. "Stannis will call it law," Jon said. "In his way, he will be right." Winterfell took back some of its sons and gave up others to the wall. Men made strong drink and were told when to stop. Sansa sat with Rosalind in a room where a fire made their hair shine and taught her to mend the little tears in a man's shirt a way that would not show. "You are a queen," Rosalind protested, and Sansa smiled and put a thread through a needle. "I am a woman who must be useful," she said. There is nothing in that takes away from what I am. Rosalind learned Winterfell's small mercies. The way the kitchen girls would put an extra spoon of sugar in a pot if they liked you. The way the guards would step aside to let you pass under the covered way when the snow came at a slant. The way old Nan's stories could still be heard in the walls if you put your ear to them and had eaten enough bread to keep your belly from distracting you. She learned too that men measured her by a scale she had not set, and she bore it the way small women have always borne men's measures, with stubborn cheer in the mornings and private tears at night when the day had not produced enough success to pay for the toll of pride. Davos made Skagos as a man makes a bad decision and then honors it to the hilt so that it might become a good thing by sheer weight of fidelity. The sea narrowed, the world narrowed. Ice seemed to grow up from the water and make its own sky. He went in among rocks that did not want a ship to thread them and found the place men point at when they say cannibal with a particular relish for the fear of it. He brought with him no gold and no pride. He brought with him a boy's name and a woman's trust and the memory of hunger and of the feeling of a rope singing out under his hands when a catch pulled too hard and you had to decide whether to hold or let go. They found Osha first. She came like a spear out of the dark of a low hut, teeth bared, a knife in her hand. Davos put his hands out, palms open, and the men behind him did not move because they were men who liked their fingers not cut off. Osha, Davos said, I've come from a fat man to fetch a thin boy. She stared at him, at the eyes that did not shift, at the hands with scars like the history of a liar made honest. You've come from wolves, she said after a long stretch of watching. And the sea. Davos said, and I have something of both in me, but I'd like to go home with neither me nor mine in my belly. She spat, which in that place was a courtesy. You will not steal him. I will not, Davos said. I will ask, and if I ask wrong, you'll kill me and feed me to your dogs, and that will be the story. If I ask right, you'll let me put him in a boat, and I'll bring him to a place where a brother and a mother will put hands on him that will make him remember his name. Rickon Stark came out with Shaggy Dog at his side, black as a hole in a forest. The boy had grown into a kind of fierce. His hair stood up as if each piece of him had decided to be trouble individually. He looked at the ship, the men, the water, the world, and his mouth made a line that said he would not beg for anything ever, not even a taste of sugar. It's cold there, Davos said, which was a foolishness. It was cold here, colder, the cold that had come to live and built itself a chair. He said it anyway because sometimes a man must start with a foolishness to get to something like truth. It has a smell you will recognize even though you cannot name it yet. There is a tree with a face that will look at you different than it looks at any other creature under heaven. Rickon did not smile. Children do not often smile when they are deciding whether this is a story they will own or one they will break. Shaggy Dog growled, a low metal sound. Davos held still and let the wolf leak his stink into Davos's own. I knew your father, he said. I did not know him the way men know a friend. I knew him the way a man knows a landmark he has always sailed by. I would like to see his son where landmarks belong. Osha put her hand on Rickon's head. If he goes with teeth, she said. He can bite me as much as he likes, Davos said gravely, and somewhere in that the boy found the angle at which this was his idea and not a man's. He nodded once and went to the boat, Shaggy Dog slinking with that peculiar direwolf slink that seems to erase distance without owning space. They made White Harbor like men come back from an argument with a god. Wyman Manderley wept without embarrassment and fed them like sailors and knights and fools all together. He made the promised pie, and it was a wonder. Davos ate carefully and with respect because he suspected that in White Harbor respect should be paid to pies the way it is paid to banners. He took the boy then by river and then by road, and they came to Winterfell in a light like milk. Sansa ran. Arya ran. Robb walked because a king does not run in his own courtyard, and because if he ran he would become a boy, and he had learned to keep both parts of himself in one skin without tearing it. He kneeled to Rickon, then lifted him up as if he weighed more than a man could bear and less than a bird. Shaggy Dog paced and sniffed gray wind and made a sound that, in other animals, might have been laughter. For a little while, there were too many Starks for any room to hold them tidily. The hall met the problem like all halls must. It put platters on trestles and ordered benches around them and told people to sit and eat. Osha took her place close to the wall, a knife at her belt and scorn in her eye for men who ate as if their mouths had no manners. Rosalind made room for her with the care of a woman who had done the math and found it came out to security and small terrors and was willing to pay the price for both. Caitlin sat where she could see all her children at once and did not bother to hide the way her breath came sometimes, as if she were just now learning how to hold air in her lungs. Theon sat by the fire wrapped in heat and quiet. When the noise rose he flinched, and when it fell he looked into the flames with a look men wear when they have met themselves in a place that did not allow anything but truth and come back anyway. Later, Robb went to him and put a cup in his hand. "I will right your father," he said. "I will right him like a lord to a lord. I will tell him that his son lives and that he will be exchanged for oaths and men who will stand aside when our people walk down to the sea." Theon's mouth moved around words that had no He yet learned how to go out into the air without breaking. "He will not," he said, which covered so many possibilities that it almost counted as prophecy. "He will send someone who has smelled a lot of salt and thinks pain is a god. Then we will deal with him," Robb said. "And if he comes with more than a mouth, we will deal with that." They sent the letters. They received in return a silence first, which grew like frost on a window into patterns that were pretty and meaningless. Then a note. It was written by a man who thought himself clever and generous. It said that the boy was no longer the boy he had been and thus no longer owed the father's debts or deserved the father's love. It said that ships could be built in numbers. It said that daughters could be married in ways that would make men forget boys. Robb sent it to the fire and did not pretend to read from it while it burned. Asha's bird came again, 2 feathers missing from one wing, as if each flight had cost it a price it had not anticipated. She set a meeting. She brought 2 ships into a cove under cliffs that had learned to listen without judging. She came ashore with 5 men and her hair bound back and her eyes seeing everything. Gray wind sniffed her hand and did not bite. She took that as compliment and insult both and bore it as an iron-born woman will, inward, with a little smirk that never quite made it to the surface. "Your numbers are better than ours inland," she said. "On the water I will outpace you with my oars and my arrogance. I propose we make each other look wise." They bargained with wariness and a surprise at how easy it was to bargain when no one lied out loud. They made a peace the sea would not call peace and that men would call cowardice or cleverness depending upon their stomachs and their loyalties. Asha left with promises sewn into her sleeves. She would keep them because they were her own, not because any man demanded it. In King's Landing, Stannis signed a decree that named Robb exactly what Davos had said it would: Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, Lord Paramount of the Trident. He signed it the way men eat bread in war, without tasting. He had fires stoked in the Red Keep. He had men sent to the Oxcross to cut timber for ships and for men to sleep in both. He had Tyrion Lannister brought before him one last time, this man with his face sewn and his wit threadbare from pain, and he looked at him the way a judge looks at a man he might have to make an ally or an example. "You kept this city from drowning in its own stupidity," he said. "You also poisoned it in a dozen small ways because you thought it was the best that could be done. I will not kill you for the first, and I will not knight you for the second. You will leave, tonight, and you will not come back without my leave." He flicked his eyes to Davos and did not have to say the thing about the sea, because both men knew it. Tyrion went with Podrick and with a bag that was too small to hold the notion of his pride. He got himself onto a ship with the calm of a man who has lost everything that can be taken and still intends to take something from the world by the mere fact of his continued living. He looked back only once and then made a practice of not looking back. Somewhere across that same sea, a girl with dragons in her lap and a city in her head was building a notion of slavery that would fit her conscience and her crown. That was far away, and the winter winds made a habit of keeping faraway things far. Spring edged into the world like a man trying to sneak into his own house after a night out, guilty and pleased and not sure whether the warmth he brought with him would be welcome. Snow became slush. Slush became mud. Mud became a skin over earth that, when pierced, smelled of rot and life in equal measure. Men stripped off one layer and then another and went back to the one they had stripped. Children found puddles and the particular joy of stepping into them. The forges worked iron into things meant for work and love and killing. Robb walked Winterfell as if to wear his name into it and to let it wear its name into him. He watched Arya put a dagger into a post and retrieve it and put it in again. He watched Sansa ease Rosalind through a room full of the kind of women who make their own little kingdoms and declare war upon a girl's shoulders with one glance. He watched Rickon pick fights with boys twice his size and win 3 of them and lose the 4th and refuse not to laugh about it. He watched Theon learn to sleep with a door closed and not bolt it from the inside, and then to sleep with it open and not wake himself, and then to sleep with it open and wake himself and go back to sleep again because that was what living men do. He wrote. He read, he signed, he refused. He found himself liking, more than he would have thought he would, the look of a ledger when the columns added up. One evening he stood on the wall and looked east, where the land goes away into something that is not land anymore, and a wind came that had a memory in it unlike the cold winds that had ruled for months. It smelled like sheep that had rolled in the first green. It smelled like a woman who has washed her hair and let it dry in air that does not bite. He breathed it and thought of nothing and everything and of how many men and women had put hands to the same stones he leaned upon and asked the same unanswerable questions of sky and breath and obligation. "We will be ready," he said aloud to the sort of God who answers some men with light and others with the sound of leaves. "When whatever comes, comes." In the deep of the night, when Winterfell slept as if someone had commanded it to, a woman walked within the godswood with no candle, guided by the sounds a heart makes when it remembers. The heart tree's face watched her as it watched all men, with patience, with a kind of attention that does not redeem or condemn. Catelyn put her hand to its trunk and felt the old slow life there like the peace a woman feels after the pains of a birth have gone and the child's breath steadies against her. "I let him be king," she whispered, not to ask for forgiveness but to state a fact into a place where facts are kept for longer than men keep them. "I did not make him eat my fear. If I have done one thing right, let it be that." "Mother," said a voice that was not the heart trees and was not the wind and was not the night learning the shapes of things. It was Sansa, her cloak half open, her hair unbound, her face in a candor that was not a girl's and not yet a woman's. "I cannot sleep." "Then we should not," Catelyn said, and they sat under the white limbs of a thing older than their house and did not pretend to be brave in the face of their own hearts. Roose Bolton came to Winterfell in the new spring with a train that did not look large until you counted the edges of it. The men at the far left who moved together too tidily, the men at the far right who never looked around, the little cluster of riders in the back whose horses had scars the way a man has a habit he does not speak of. He offered his congratulations on the siege, on the marriage, on the return of the boy. He offered dry observations about the wall and its maintenance. He offered a gift, a skin of wine very old, whose meaning was the meaning of all gifts given by men like Roose. Robb had it tasted and tasted it himself anyway, not out of bravado but to prove to himself that he could drink from a cup set in front of him and not choke on the memory of his father in a cell. They dined without cheer and with civility. Roose ate with the neatness of a cat. He spoke of the Iron Bank and of loans that would not be forgiven. He spoke of men who had gone to ground since the Dreadfort and of how such men are sometimes useful to those who can stomach their stench. He did not speak at length of his son. He did not speak at all of sympathy. He left the next morning with a bow that did not bend far enough to be thought a compliment. Men would say later that all of this had been the saving of the North. Others would say it had been the beginning of its next trouble. Men tell stories. Winter writes the true version with the small pen of daily bread and broken harness mended with old leather and women's patience made into policy. The wall stood. King's Landing did not burn. The rock kept its counsel while wearing its pride like a cape too big for a boy who had inherited it. The sea made bargains in the mouths of those who swore to never bargain. A boy named Rickon threw snow at his sister and laughed like a dog let off its chain. Arya put her dagger into a post until the post had more story in it than wood. Sansa turned a kitchen into a court by virtue of sitting there every morning and learning the names of the women who made men believe the place held itself up with good bread. And somewhere far away to the east, A girl with dragons taught herself to say words like tax and levy and law in a way that made men follow her for reasons that were not just the glamour of fire. Somewhere to the south, a priestess stared into flames and saw ghosts with blue eyes and a wall of night and a boy in black whose shadow threw a king's crown around it like a startled bird. Somewhere under mountains, things old and slow rolled in their sleep and dreamed of summer's ending. Winterfell remembered its kings, and it remembered its boys, and it learned to tell them apart. Robb walked the walls and rode the roads and wrote the letters, and when he was asked what he had learned, he said, that a house is not a stone but the hands that lift it up and set it back when it falls. He said, that there is a time for the sword and a time for the ladle. He said, to the man inside himself who still wanted to roar and be seen, be reasonable and then be kind, and then be hard and keep your name clean even when your hands are not. When summer came, as it always does though men forget it in winter, the grass grew through the cracks where blood had dried dark months ago. Lambs stumbled over the world as if its edges were jokes played upon them by gods. Boats came up the white knife with bellies full. A pie cooled on a sill and no one stole it. A mother told a child to wash and the child said no and was swatted and went. A man looked up at the heart tree and saw nothing and then saw that seeing nothing was the point. The sea kept talking to the rock in a language only the stubborn learn. The rock answered not in words but in the way it held its face to the west and did not turn away even when storms came with laughter in their mouths. Beneath it, men dug and died and stacked stone into neat piles and made their loves and lied to each other about how long the gold would last. In the far north, the wind brought down from the high places a smell like old bone. Jon Snow stood on the wall and smelled it and did not say a word because he knew that everything he could say would be true and none of it would be useful. He sent birds. He sharpened swords. He walked the line. He thought of a brother in the south who was not a brother-in-law but was a brother in everything that counts. He thought of fire seemed too far away to be saved from. And in the quiet hour before dawn, when the world belongs to servants, to mothers who have woken because a child has coughed in another room, to men who must piss and do not want to wake their wives, Robb Stark stood in his hall and looked upon the banners that had hung and those that would hang and those that would be folded and put away and thought, not with despair but with that particular sort of happiness men get when they have worked until their sweat makes a new smell, that the work would never end and that there was joy in that too. He put his hand upon the stone. He felt it cool and indifferent and exactly as alive as it needed to be to do the job men had set for it. He smiled, a small private thing, the sort of smile a man allows himself when no poet is looking. The door opened and Arya slipped in, hair tangled, eyes bright with mischief or battle or both. "Can't sleep," she said. "You never could," he answered. "There's a fox in the chicken yard," she said. "Want to hunt it?" "I am a king," he said, with the gravity of a boy remembering his father's voice. "You are my brother," she said, with the ferocity of a sister who has walked too long without such a thing to say. He took up his cloak. The dawn had not decided itself yet, pale and thinking. They went out together, their steps soft on stone that remembered the weight of men who had taken other steps in other winters. Grey Wind joined them, then Shaggy Dog, then two hounds who did not know that they were lesser creatures among these. The world smelled of straw and liver and frost. The fox had indeed found his way in. He ran when the door opened. He ran like all small bright things must in a world full of larger hungers. They ran him round the yard and into a corner and then out of it. They let him go in the end, laughing, breath-making ghosts in the air. The fox went to ground under a pile of timber and lay there and shivered and thanked whatever gods foxes have that men are sometimes boys again before the sun wakes them. Robb turned his face up to a sky that was neither night nor full day and let the cold bite him once more as if to remind him of all his bargains with it. "There," he said and pointed, and Arya squinted and saw nothing and then saw, because he had said so, a thin falcon against a pale sea of cloud. They watched it go. They watched it be small, then nothing. They stood there a long time, and then they went in where bread waited and a child in a side room woke and called for a mother who was already on her feet. The day began again, as days will, with little things that add to movements that look like history if one stands far enough away. Somewhere in the rock, A mason put down his trowel and wiped his brow and told a boy to fetch more straw for the mortar. Somewhere in King's Landing, a judge who had been a soldier once knocked upon a door and told a woman that the law is not the same as justice and that he would try to make the former taste less like ash. Somewhere in White Harbor, Wyman Manderly cut a pie and made a small noise of appreciation at the heat in the crust and said nothing to the assembled about how men sometimes deserve what they get and sometimes get what they deserve. Somewhere in the Dreadfort, a skin stretched and dried, and a man with pale eyes looked at it and saw in it all his triumphs and none of his failures. And in the north, under the heart tree, where the snow had held off for a day and the air smelled of cedar and cold, the sap moved slow as law, and the face in the bark looked at nothing and everything and did not blink. The work went on. The wolves kept their counsel. The walls remembered hands. The sea pushed and pulled, patient as a mother, brutal as a father, inevitable as both. Winter and spring exchanged polite lies and went about their business. And the boy who had taken a house with a rope and a tide learned, more fully than even he had known, that the hardest victories are those a man must win again each morning with his sleeves rolled up and the simple stubbornness to keep at it until the light fails.